When he went to bed that night, he couldn't sleep. All he could think about was staying alive. Jacob had just cheated his brother out of a third of the inheritance, robbed him of his chance to bear the family name, and his brother put a bounty on him, said, if I see him, I'll kill him myself. So Jacob, whose name means deceiver, con man, swindler, spirals into depression and makes a run for it. He's out in the middle of a field in between two towns, pretty much God-forsaken area, middle of nowhere, and he decides to sleep, and he can't. And so he takes a stone and he props the stone up behind his head, I guess like that, so he could use it as a pillow. I've had pillows like that. And it worked. He fell asleep. And when he slept, he had a dream. And the dream was of a large staircase that started on earth and it went into the heavens. And he saw angels that were on earth that were climbing the staircase, and they were carrying things from earth into heaven. And then there were angels that were in heaven carrying things down to earth. And Jacob was amazed at this. He was like we are. He thought there is a God and there is a heaven, but they're just far apart. The earth is pretty much disenchanted, which means it's been drained of all the magic. It's not that God doesn't exist. God does exist. He just weighs inconsequentially on everything. He's not as interesting as television or as whatever else I've got to do today. And so for Jacob, heaven and God were always up there, and the mortals were down here. But that night in the dream, he saw that heaven and earth were actually intersected, and there was traffic moving all the time between earth and heaven. Then he saw something else. He saw God himself standing at the top of the staircase. Only in the Hebrew it says he was standing right next to him. And this God started to make promises. Gods never make promises to mortals, because the moment you do, you obligate yourself. But he's making promises. He says to Jacob, I am the God of your daddy and granddaddy. Okay, I've paraphrased that a little bit. He said, whatever I promised them, I will do with you. And then he listed them. I will give you the land you're laying on. I will give you more descendants than you can count. I will bless your life, and then I will bless the world through your life. You will bless the world because of me in you. And then before he left, God said, and there's one more thing. I will always be with you. I will watch over you. And I will never leave until I fulfill every last word of these promises. Well, it rattled him so much that Jacob woke up, and he couldn't get his bearings at first. He had to figure, was that real, or was that just a dream? Or was it actually both? Was it maybe a dream that was real? What if it's true? What if heaven and earth are closer than I thought? What if there is traffic up and down all the time? What if there is parts of this world that I cannot see that are just as... Finally, he mumbled to himself, surely God was in this place, and I didn't know it. He says, God was in this place, and I didn't know it. Now, tell me how that happens. How can God be in a place and you not know it? How can someone that big and overwhelming be in a place and you not know it? So he takes a stone and he props it up, the one from behind his head, and he sets it on this little pillar, and then he pours oil on it, and he says, how awesome is this place? It is none other than Bet-El, the house of God, the gate of heaven. Well, he goes on his way, and a lot happens. Jacob gets married twice, has a bunch of kids, has like 11 guys. There's one still coming, but he has already 11, has a couple girls through 2 wives. Makes peace with his brother Esau, who was going to kill him. Then he makes war on a tribe called Shechem. And when he does that, the people from Shechem threaten to kill him. Now Jacob finds himself in exactly the same place he was years ago. He says to his family, it's now a tribe, he says, I have become a stench to the people of Shechem, and because we're so small, they're going to attack us and they're going to kill us. And then God shows up a second time, says to Jacob, what was the name of that place back there where I saw you the first time? He says, Bet-El, house of God. Yahweh says, gate of heaven, right? Yeah. Yahweh says, why don't you go back there? Build an altar. I'll meet you there at the altar. Jacob turns to his family and says, you better get rid of your idols. He said, I just ran into the real thing. You better get rid of your idols. And by the way, take a bath. And by the way, change your clothes. You can't just show up. So that's what the whole family does. They prepare themselves for a few days, and they travel back to Bet-El, where Jacob builds this altar so he can meet with God who once met with him. And when he builds it, Yahweh appears another time and says, this time, let's change your name. It's no longer Jacob, swindler, con man. Today, we'll call you Israel, which means he struggles with God at altars. I tell that story because it's normative, I think, of most Christian lives. Everything about a Christian life rises from an encounter with God. You see, God is just as interested in meeting you as you are interested in meeting him. And the place where you meet is holy ground. And that is more than just an emotional experience, though it may be deeply emotional. It is an actual encounter between two persons, and the other is just as real as the one. And in that encounter, Almighty God makes promises. And before it's over, the mortals make vows. Altars become thin places between heaven and earth where God and people meet. And there's two kinds. There's the kind you build after the encounter. And then there's the kind you build in order to have the encounter. You need both kinds. As a rule of thumb, the importance of any conversation you have in your life is in inverse proportion to the number of people involved in it. The most important conversations are ones you have with God alone in a sacred place where He makes promises and you make vows. Out of that place, the rest of your life will rise. Underneath every strong Christian family is a parent or parents that have found that place, and they enter it consistently, and they have conversations with God about their kids that their kids know nothing about, and they will never know anything about it. But mom and dad have been in a room with God making a deal for the life of their kids. And later on, we'll call it luck, ambition, talent. It started here. You need one of these. Listen to me. You need one of these in your life. You need a place where you can get alone with God and you can talk in private and say things you don't tell anybody else, not even your spouse. Because out of that place will come the rest of your life. So back when the people of God decided to leave the empire and go back and rebuild the city. Remember, we've been talking about this, the Ezra and Nehemiah story. The people that have spent 70 years in exile, a whole generation or two was born in exile. They never saw freedom, never saw a temple, never read the Bible or the Torah, never knew a priest personally. They just heard about these things. But there were a few of them, said Ezra, that God stirred their heart. And when He stirred their heart, this whole generation of people that really didn't know God formally, at least not like their parents knew God. They were, how do we say it today, spiritual but not religious. And they were, how else do we say it, deconstructing. They're deconstructing faith. Don't get nervous unless you're over 40. The faith that they were deconstructing was their parents, and some of it needed it. So while they were trying to figure out what is true and what is genuine and what is of God, and how can I be part of the movement without being part of the church? It made everybody else nervous, but they decided to go back. These people least likely to do it Well, here's how I think it went. One of them said to the other, hey, why don't we go back to Jerusalem and plant a church? What? Yeah, we'll plant a church because it's the fastest, most efficient way to win people. What? Win people. I mean, get them in church. So like if we get people in church, we've won them. So let's plant a church. But the other one said, that doesn't sound right. Let's build an altar. And the altar will build the church. Because God knows you can build a church without one. And whatever these people didn't know, which was a lot, they got a lot right. They figured out somehow that if you wanted to rebuild a city, you needed more than a government because you needed to actually change the lives of citizens. Governments can pass laws, but they can't legislate morality. They can make it harder for the wealthy to hoard their wealth, but they can't keep them from doing it. You can't make someone generous. That requires a genuine internal change of heart. That's people, not programs that we're talking about. And you can't change a person's heart until you immerse them in something like a temple where they are hearing consistently the claims of that deity, whatever those are. But you can have temples, lots of them, that mean nothing until you have an altar. You need a ground zero. You need a fulcrum. You need some place to start, a place where that which is divine meets with that which is mortal. And in that exchange, the divine makes promises, the mortal makes vows, and the mortal is changed. There's a divine spark. Something happens in the life of that person. That's how change happens. So whatever else they didn't know, they knew that for sure. Ground zero to rebuilding the city, whether anybody knows this or not, is the presence of the Holy One. And he doesn't just hang out everywhere. He is in some places more than he's in others. People, we have to have a place, they must have said, where we can go. And when we're there, we know he is. And where words matter, they're elevated to another level because they were set in the front of the divine. So they pick up their stuff, they go back to Jerusalem, and it says on the first day of the 7th month, they rebuild the altar, and they rebuild it over the top of the old one. And they did it, it says, so they could offer sacrifices. And these sacrifices were for the Feast of Trumpets, and they were for the Day of Atonement, and they were for the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Shelters, where the people would build like a lean-to, and they would celebrate Israel coming out of Egypt years ago. They chose the 7th month, the same month that they dedicated the first temple. So whatever these people didn't know about religion, they knew this. You don't make this stuff up. You go back and find out what did the Holy One say? What does he want? That's what you put on here. You don't come up to an altar with anything that feels right. Well, I said to myself, this is what I want to give. Dude, if you do that, you're here. Determining the claims of your religion. This is what I think is a good sacrifice. And you've put him down here. Someone who is just happy to have your attention. No. You got to switch those. You got to start by saying, what does the Holy One require of us? And how do we bring that with all that we have? You say, man, that's expensive. Of course it's expensive. You see how this changes the entire way religion works? Well, do you? It's quiet. It's quiet. You see the flip-flop? We've somehow put the audience up here and God down here, like a mother whose kids have outgrown him. He's just happy for them to call every now and then and say, well, good Lord, still thinking of you, before they get off to work. You see that? They didn't make that mistake. They went back to Leviticus 23 and they said, what did God tell us he wanted? And that's what we got to put on here. Well, I'll get to the point. I think that we live in a day and age where today people are longing for a sense of the divine. They appear to you, some of you, to be too secular. But if you look closely, there are signs of hunger for the divine. I spent a month in cathedrals last June, and I noticed a pattern. I stood at the door that opened from the plaza to the cathedral, and every single person, bar none, when they crossed the threshold of that door, went into a posture of sacredness without anybody saying a word. And I mean, they came from all places. I'd watch people that were busy and chaotic and frenetic, and the second they walked in to that cathedral, they all, without exception, looked at the front where the altar was, and most of them got down and genuflected. I watched a guy come walking in out of complete chaos, and I thought to myself, this ought to be interesting. That old boy got one step across that threshold, and he went straight down and crossed himself. And then he found a pew over here, and he sat in the pew, and he stared for the longest time at that altar. I watched a young woman come in, never said a word. She got across the threshold. She crossed herself. She went about 5 seats down and sat there and just stared toward the front with tears coming down her face. The last night I was there was in St. Paul's Cathedral, and when everybody else sat down, one guy, poorly dressed, stood over to the side, and he couldn't even sit. He just stood there and stared at the altar for the longest time, and some of the crowd was thinking, sit down, boy, this is church. He couldn't. He was captivated by the possibility that the divine might be in that place. Oh, there you go again. You say you're disenchanted. Some of you have a deep bias, a fully formed suspicion of anything that sounds like a genuine encounter. You weren't born that way. This generation taught you to think that way, and they were wrong. My son tells me that people
in their 20s are going to rock shops and buying sacred rocks that they keep in their cars, in their office. They sometimes hold them. They'll say things over the top of those rocks. Another person's burning sage, and he stands over it, and he says he inhales, and he says, it purges me of negative thinking. And when you hear these things, you're like, oh man, at least they believe the world is enchanted. At least they still believe things supernatural intersect with humanity. Say what you want about their theology, which is bad. I'll give you that. But they got this much right. You understand it's possible to be in church your whole life like this. Never expect prayers to get answered. Miracles surprise you. All I'm saying is, at the same time in history, when there is this deep, quiet hunger for the divine, what so many churches have done is they have swapped out the altar for a stage and performers, second-rate bands with third-rate TED Talks. I'm not talking about our band, but I am talking about our preacher. Somehow we tell ourselves, if we just had more interesting services. People don't want what's interesting anymore. Man, they had that and it didn't work. What people want today is something that is genuine. They want something that is expensive, that costs something that they can't afford, something that disrupts their life, something that changes their life. They want a story that you can't contain in 30 minutes, something big enough to pull the rest of their life into its wake so it has purpose once again. God knows they've lived for years watching the generations ahead of them settle down in Babylon. How did kings say it? They worshiped God, but they also worshiped the gods of the region. So you couldn't really say that they weren't Christians. They were. It was just Jesus plus. And that generation saw it. And there is a hunger in their heart to come back to churches that say, no, everything rises from a holy place. It comes out of people who do things in quiet, who beg for the life of their people, their kids, their leaders. So here's how I think we fulfill this. I said there are two altars. There's one where God surprised you. And if that's true for you, you heard several stories up here a few minutes ago, and every one of them had this in common. Nobody went looking for it. They walked into their room and they were on their knees, or they were in a recliner, they were in a car, wherever they were. Bam! God all of a sudden showed up and it rattled them and it changed their life. If that's true of you, go back. Find that place. About 8-9 years ago, I went back to the Winding Creek camp. I don't know why they call it that. It's not much of a creek. And I went there as a kid. I was a child in youth group, and I was 16 one day in Day Memorial Chapel, this old rustic white building. And Bob Zool was talking about a call to ministry, and he got halfway through his description. If this is true of your life, you might be called. I'm 16, I'm a preacher's kid, and I just remember thinking, oh, crap.
I left that place. I was rattled. It's the last thing I wanted to be. And I went home, and it took about 2 months before my dad finally said to me, "Man, you've been angry for the last 2 months. What's wrong?" Finally, I had the nerve to tell him. I said, "A couple months ago, I was in this, I don't know, talk or something, and this old man, he's up there talking about a call to ministry, and man, gosh, I hope this isn't true, but it was pretty close." Dad said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't want to do that." He said, "Well, you know God won't leave you alone until you say yes." I said, "And the devil won't leave me alone until I say no. So you're telling me I'm now in between God and the devil for the rest of my life? This is a fight I didn't pick." He said, "Well, that's sort of how it works. Thanks, counselor." So I came off to school and enlisted as something else. I wasn't going to do that. Now, about 35 years later, they asked me to come back and speak at that camp. And the opening night before I spoke, I look across this dirt road, and there's Day Memorial Chapel. I thought, are you guys ever going to tear that down? So I go inside of it, and nothing has changed because Wesleyans don't have money. They can't update anything. And I looked to the front's still where it was. I got all the way to the back where I was sitting. I got down like this, and I just stared at the place where I was sitting, and I just said, "Man, what were you thinking, Lord?" I must have said that 1,000 times, sometimes 4 times a week. And I said it again that night, but I also said, "You know, at the end of the day, you did exactly what you said you would do, and I don't know how. I sure don't know how. But thank you." This is what you got to do first. You have to find that place in your life where God intercepted you, and you have to go back to it, and you have to compress the years together, and you have to say, at the end of the day, you are good. Are you there? Second thing you got to do is you got to make one of these. I don't mean build the whole thing. I mean, you have to have a place in your life where you regularly go to meet with God. A place that you don't use much for any other thing. I know this is obvious for some of you, but for others, it always surprises me the number of Christians who do not have a mechanism in their life for hearing from God consistently. He doesn't know where to find them because they're never in the same place twice. So find a place, get in it every day, every other day, open your word, read it aloud. Don't just read it aloud. Use 3 of the 5 senses. Listen to the voice while you read it. Don't ask yourself, what does it say? Ask yourself, what do I hear? When I hear the word, what do I hear come out of these pages? Do this repeatedly in a place like an altar, and then say things to God in that space that you never repeat to anyone else. And if he says things to you in that space, you always make sure you have permission to share them with someone else. What's said in private stays private unless the one speaking has given you the right to say it. And if he does, then you'll say it with humility.